Academic Affairs, and on behalf of Loyola University New Orleans, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you here for this very special event. As part of our commitment to educational excellence and critical thinking, and to fostering learning and talent development of our students and our entire campus, Loyola has had a long tradition of inviting speakers who challenge the status quo and stimulate discourse and analysis of significant social issues and ideas, and whose visits become an important part of our collective intellectual experience. Slavoj Zizek, who has been described as one of the most formidably brilliant political philosophers and cultural critics of our times, is that kind of guest speaker.
We have some late-breaking news. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has just named Elvis the Zizek of rock and roll. Okay. To me, there's only one real question to confront in this introduction, which is why Slavoj Zizek should be here at this particular moment, why it's so important, why I thought it was so important that he be here, and that when history is retrospectively written, that this moment will be an important moment. I think there are two reasons. Well, one is, I think he has done more than anyone to help us understand the problem of fetishistic disavowal, as he repeats often the concept of je sais bien mais quand même, I know very well, but nevertheless. I know, but I act as if I don't know. In a certain sense, New Orleans is the symbol of fetishistic disavowal. We are the place who knew for years what was to come, the disaster that was coming, but people acted as if it was not coming. Even after we had the disaster that occurred, which was far less significant than the one we're still facing, President Bush could say no one could foresee the breaching of the levees. So I think in a sense we are the symbol of that disorder in a rather unique way. Slavoj wrote an article about New Orleans that I love very much, The Subject Supposed to Loot and Rape, which was about fantasies about New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. It's a very interesting title. Of course, it comes from the subject supposed to know, but there are two real meanings of subject supposed. On the one hand, we have the subject that is supposed. This is supposed to have happened in New Orleans. But the other meaning is the supposed subject as opposed to the object. Who is it that loots? Who is it that rapes? Who is the victim? Who is the perpetrator? Which brings you to the other reason why I think it's so important that he's here and that he speak about violence. Who is the victim of violence? Who is the perpetrator of violence? In a certain sense, we are the symbol of violence. We have had the highest murder rate in the country. We have had rampant crime. That's the visible violence, but many people don't realize that the underlying violence is the violence of being the incarceration capital of the world. The whole generation is subjected to daily violence in OPP and other prisons in this state. Who is the victim of violence? That's the question. In a certain sense, we embody the concept that Slavoj talks about, the part of no part. People ask, are we Americans? In a certain sense, we're the bad conscience of America. We're the part that is not part. And in a certain sense, that makes us the universal part, as he pointed out. So I'm hoping that, as a result of his presentation, we'll begin to understand the nature of violence and the nature of our place in a system of violence. So it's with great pleasure and honor that I introduce Slavoj Zizek.
Thanks very much. I'm here for the third time and I really like to be here. I'm very grateful for not only for incredible hospitality, the introductions. I also like very much the way my arrival was prepared. For example, those t-shirts, the portrait of me there, I love it, because if some of you are ladies old enough to have daughters who are in dating age, I'm asking you a simple question referring to that image of me, like, would you allow that guy to take your daughter? Never. Another thing that I like is I feel as if in good old totalitarian sites, times, I have this fascist guard here. You are free to applaud, but if you don't applaud enough, they will. More seriously, I deeply agree with what you said, how the fight for the status of New Orleans is precisely, is it part of the United States or not? If you speak to those arrogant, upper middle class, multiculturalist liberals from the North, their idea is that they sympathize with you, but precisely in the same way as you sympathize with foreigners. For them, to cut a long story short, you are part of Latin America, practically a banana republic which by mistake ended here. And the point is, no, you are genuinely, maybe even more than those colleagues from the North, part of the United States. And I think that this exceptional point, now you may disagree with me here, but nonetheless I think it didn't begin only recently. I remember already from when I was young, which means unfortunately more than 30 years ago, I discovered this area of United States through one, I think, of the great American novels, although I don't agree with all its political implications, All the King's Men. And it's for me, what interested me is, of course, the figure of Huey Long, who is behind. And I claim that, you see, this is maybe one of the ways, probably some of you will disagree here with me, to test someone, is he a real radical left or a liberal? Liberals are usually horrified, proto-fascist and so on and so on. I've read books about Huey Long. I claim this is a mistake. Huey Long was not your version of Father Coughlin, McCoughlin, or what, and those disgusting two anti-Semites. He was, okay, whatever you call populist demagogy, but you know that at the same time, I think he was the first one to build hospitals for black people, to give to women positions and so on. He broke the rule of this very restrained, wealthy, so-called liberal elite. This has to be done. He also embodies for me, in a way, the limitation of American democracy, not that ours is better in Europe, right? In the sense that a simple liberal criticism of Huey Long is too short. The tragedy is that only a guy like Huey Long was able to do it, what had to be done. Okay, so now be prepared nonetheless for some theory. Since we are here at Loyola University, and since, although I'm an atheist, I define myself as a Christian atheist, I would like to begin in a very religious way, but sincerely, by a quote from Paul in Ephesians 6:12. He provided, I think, one of the first perfect definitions of critique of ideology. Maybe some of you know the quote. Here is the literal quote, okay, literal, official translation. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against leaders, against authorities, against the world rulers, the Greek term kosmokratoras, the world rulers of this darkness, against the wonderful expression, spiritual wickedness in the heavens. You see, it's a wonderful expression. It's not up in heaven there is purity, common people are dirty. No, wickedness is up there in heavens. Or, to translate Paul into today's language, our struggle is not against concrete corrupted individuals, but against those in power in general, against their authority, against the global order and the ideological mystification which sustains it. That's what Paul really meant. But So what I want to do based on this is just to go on practicing the old, half-forgotten art of the critique of ideology. When then are we in ideology? When we read an ideological proclamation, whichever statement, American patriotism, socialism, democracy, we are well aware that this is not how real people experience it. In order to pass from abstract propositions to people's real lives, we have to add to the abstract propositions the unfathomable density of a life-world context. And I claim ideology are not abstract propositions in themselves, freedom, democracy, whatever. Ideology is this very density of a symbolic network, which, I use the term here in the Kantian sense, schematizes these abstract propositions in the sense of renders them livable, provides the background for the way we concretely understand them. Take military ideology. It becomes livable. Officially, it's discipline, struggle for your country, and so on. But I claim it becomes livable only against the background of the obscene, unwritten rules and rituals, marching chants, bragging, sexual innuendos, in which it is embedded. For me, when I was young, I served in my country, ex-Yugoslavia, the army, and this was for me almost the moment of formation of my insights, where, to be frank, I'm a kind of a, what you call control freak, obsessional neurotic, almost a fascist character. I like order, efficiency. So quite openly, I was glad to go to the army. But then came the disappointment of my life. Army is not that. Nothing functioned. It was all one big obscenity, improvisation, and so on and so on. And it took me some time to get it that this was not any kind of subversive resistance. That's how power functions. What appears to be a secret resistance to power, all the obscenities, dirty jokes, and so on, is the way power is sustained. Which is why, my first thesis, if there is an ideological experience at its purest, it is at the moment when we adopt the attitude of wise, ironic distance and laugh at the follies we are ready to believe. You know, when you say, no bullshit, cut the crap, let's go to how things really are. Be careful. When someone uses that language, it means you will get ideology at its purest. And I can even give you an example. You know, popular philosopher Harry Frankfurt, who wrote the book on bullshit. You remember it was a mega bestseller, short essay. I immediately was suspicious. And my suspicion was well justified because I read an interview with Frankfurt. Probably he didn't dare to do this here about 2 years ago in a German philosophical journal, where they asked him, okay, but give me an example. Do you have an example of today in the United States of a politician who is not bullshitting? He said, John McCain. Here is the PR. So again, what is ideology? During a public debate that I had with a person whom I don't especially like, Bernard-Henri Lévy, the French new philosopher, at New York Public Library, something interesting happened. First, he made a pathetic case for liberal tolerance. Something like, would you not like to live in a society where you can make fun of the predominant religion without the fear of being killed for it, where women are free to dress the way they like and choose the partner as a partner to men they love, and so on and so on. And I made, I must say, a similar pathetic case for communism. With the growing food crisis, ecological crisis, and so on and so on. Is there not a need to find a new way of collective action which radically differs from market as well as from state administration? The irony was that when we both stated our case in these abstract terms, we both couldn't but agree with each other. I said, what should I say? No, I want women to be oppressed and submitted to kill. Of course, I want that. And even he said, oh, if this is communism, then I'm a communist, and so on. This means that we were in ideology. You got it? Because we obliterated this dense background, as it were background noise, on account of which, when you say today things like he said, it's not just what you get, it's the whole set of unwritten rules which provide a very specific, concrete meaning of what you are saying. I don't want to lose your time here, but I've elaborated this in some of my last books, I think especially in violence. This is a phenomenon, namely, which immensely fascinates me. What a complex phenomenon social rules, norms are. Why? Rules, norms are not only simply norms which tell you how to act. For reasons which can be nicely developed in psychoanalytic theory, norms are never consistent. Whenever you want to become part of a certain collective, you discover that there are some written or unwritten, whatever, rules regulating the interaction of people who are in. But then you soon discover something else, that it's not only explicit rules which matter. What matters even more are a kind of a meta, higher level rules which tell you how to deal with the explicit rules. For example, often things are officially prohibited, but the true message between the lines is do it if you are not an idiot. You know, like in sexuality, in some countries, even at the level of criminal. For example, it can be nicely demonstrated that the entire Soviet Union functioned only through smuggling to black market and so on, so the official rules had to be violated. And if you followed the explicit rules, you were simply an idiot. You didn't get it. But a much more interesting example is the opposite one. It's not that the law or the rules prohibit something, but between the lines the message is do it. It's when you are allowed, solicited even, to do something on condition that you don't really do it. You know, like you are given a free choice on condition that you make the right choice, as it were. And this is another fascinating topic. I think this is the fundamental, maybe zero-level ideological mechanism, to give you a choice on condition that, the choice is free. In one of my early books, so I hope you don't know the example, I quote an example precisely from the time when I was in the Yugoslav army, which is very simple, even stupid, but it's wonderfully how purely clinical this example is. I don't know how it is in your army, but probably in most armies it is as it was in Yugoslav army where I served, where after the beginning, the first drill, 2-3 weeks, you swear the oath. You know, it's the solemn procedure, all you soldiers are gathered, and then you do the usual bullshit. I am ready to do everything up to dying for my country, and so on and so on. Then after all of us pronouncing these words in public, each of us then had to sign the oath. And then a friend of mine, I wouldn't dare to do it, but he did it, he was one of my heroes. When it came to signing the oath, he said, no, I will not sign the oath. Then the officer asked him, tell him, but are you crazy? You will be arrested. You must sign it. The guy said, wait a minute, give me a clear answer. Am I obliged? Are you ordering me to sign it or not? And you know, it was a magic moment when a crack in ideological edifice appeared. Because the officer told him, no, are you crazy? This is an oath, this is your free act. Then the guy said, no, but if it's a free act, I will not do it. Tell me just, it's an order and I will do it. And then a miracle happened. I have a photocopy of this. The officer wrote him on a piece of paper an order to freely sign. This is how it functions. Okay, it's never as simple as that. I'm well aware of it. But what I'm saying is that if you want to understand an ideology, you know, always look at these ambiguities. It's never what it says, it's how you relate to what it says. Where can you feel this gap at its purest? Precisely in what people usually celebrate as spontaneous outbursts. For example, you are in a formal debate, then you explode, you get bored, so you do whatever. Let's say you start swearing, dirty words, and so on. I claim if you look closely at how this functions, it has nothing to do with any kind of spontaneous explosion or whatever. Precisely these allegedly spontaneous outbursts are the most codified part of it. You must learn them. You become part of a civilization, collective, whatever, precisely when you learn these carnivalesque moments of how to violate the explicit rules. Let me take not only swearing, but 2, 3 other examples. For example, drinking hard alcohol or smoking. I claim there is nothing originally if you smoke and if you remember how you learned to smoke. It's usually first when you were, I don't know, in your early teens, in some initiatic group where somebody offers you, are you a man enough? If you're a man, try it. You try it, and I can guarantee you, if you're normal, if you're an alien, it's different. But there are aliens. I know 2 aliens in the United States. Pat Buchanan is still human. Pat Robertson is an alien. Or in Cat, the Mormon politician. 2 of them are on my alien list, but that's another question. But I would say that if you're one admitting, your first reaction was you started to cough, you didn't like it. Smoking is inherently an unpleasant experience. But then you were told, but wait a minute, that's the transgressive thing to do, and so on and so on. So it comes afterwards that you start to enjoy. It's the same with drinking, if not wine, at least the hard liquors. I mean, they have a bitter taste, they burn, so when you have a slightly dissolute father who tells you when you are 6, 7, be a man, try. It's a favor to your father, it's not. Then you learn. So again, it's strictly, I claim our pleasure in this kind of things is strictly a second level pleasure. It has more to do with, how should I put it, with social group, with participating in a collective act of transgression or what. I mean, let's be frank here. If you want to drink for pure pleasure, you usually do some stupid fruit juice. You don't go to And I claim, but I don't have time to develop in detail, that it goes the same even for sex. I can understand if you want pleasure, masturbate. It's much simpler and so on and so on. I claim that collective sex, in the sense of not orgy, but drinking with a partner, it's strictly something you have to learn. It's a learned experience. It doesn't come natural. Again, so you see my point, which is that violating the public rules is not done by a private ego, but is enjoined by the same public rules which allegedly prohibit this. This is what accounts for all the snobbery of artistic taste. For example, me coming from snobbish Europe, if you like classical music, I do, and we know who are supposed to be the big guys, Beethoven, his symphonies, and so on. But if you are in the closed circle of those who pretend to know, if you make one of the obvious choices, like, I like Beethoven's 9th Symphony, you're considered a total idiot. The trick is to select a work which is usually neglected or considered minimal and to say, but this is the real one. And if you know Beethoven, the field is getting pretty narrow there. When I was young, you could get away by opting a late string quartets. They are out now, too well known. Now you must go, maybe because they are really hard and boring, the late piano sonatas are one of the candidates and so on, if you like them. So the point is, again, that it's only this slight deviation from the common wisdom which accounts for you strictly being in. And I claim the same goes to marriage. This idea of marriage as fidelity is typical adolescent idea. Since I'm at the Catholic University, I would say the whole wisdom of a Catholic church is based on the idea on what? That there is more than just the same root in the 2 words adult and adultery. You become adult when you know how to practice adultery. No, I mean it, unfortunately, literally. When you understand how how to put it, the institution reproduces itself through its small transgressions, exemptions, and so on and so on. Let me give you the ultimate example. Did you see, to be ironic, of course, one of the greatest movies of Western civilization, The Sound of Music? Look at it. It's a wonderful example of ideology. What's the true message of the movie? You know the story. Sister Maria sent to take care of the children of von Trapp family. Then she, okay, in the movie Julie Andrews, falls in love with Baron von Trapp, Christopher Plummer. Then she falls in love too much, in a panic, being sexually attracted to the Baron. She goes, you remember, that's the crucial scene of the film again. She goes to the Mother Superior and tells her, I'm still tempted by the Baron, what should I do? It's a call to punishment, no? She asks, make me pray, make me fast, whatever. And then there is an incredible scene, which is totally obscene. I'm always almost ashamed of watching it. Do you remember what happens there? The Mother Superior sings a song. An obscene song which starts like, climb every mountain. And the message of that song is, go back, seduce the guy, screw like crazy. And that's, you see, I claim there is no subversive whatever here. This is how Catholicism functions. You know, like, I say this in all respect, and not to blame Catholicism, Protestants are even worse and so on. Like, you know, the message is not obey and don't do it. That's the explicit message. The implicit message is obey, pay lip service, and then secretly you can have all that you want. Maybe even, sorry for the obscenity, as a priest, all the small boys, and so on and so on. And strictly mean, without any offense to Catholicism, I think it's a great thing that effectively there must be something of what I call an inherent transgression. The cases of pedophilia are so numerous that you cannot account for it in this simple way. Yes, of course, priests are humans like others, so we have them. No, they have too much of them. It's a much more complex thing. But again, what I wanted to emphasize is how this is how religion works today. Even if you read some statements in most conservative Catholic countries. For example, recently I was in Poland, a very conservative, anti-Semitic country. It's very difficult to meet a Polish guy who is not a Jew and who is not anti-Semitic. But nonetheless, I was shocked about how there even Catholic fundamentalists relate to sexuality. On the one hand, they have the usual dogma, you know, only in marriage, blah, blah, blah. But then it was so clear that their real message to the young people was a much more obscene one. It was, look, in a permissive society where you just can do whatever you want, it gets boring. We offer you this thrilling additional pleasure of giving you rules which you are not only allowed, but secretly even solicited to of course, not publicly, to violate, and then this makes it for a much more thrilling sexual experience. A couple of times the priest even openly claims it, and incidentally, there is a truth in it, obviously. Like, what about the opposite position? Someone like Marquis de Sade, brutally just enjoy. I mean, I hope you got it after reading, for example, his most mechanical, systematic work, 120 days in Sodom, I think, or Gomorrah, Sodom. Yeah. That how 600 cases of perversion. That after a certain number, I would say after 150, 200, it's totally desexualized. It becomes a pure formal logic permutation, like 430. You take a dog, an ox, a woman, 2 childs, and how they do it. Next example, you know, you take 2 dogs, 2 women, and whatever. It's totally desexualized. So, again, this complexity has to be taken into account. But where are we today here? I claim today this is more, I would say, a traditional ideology, which you can locate at all levels. This, how should I call it, 2-level ideology. The first thing we should say today is that it's often the opposite. If traditional ideology functions in this way, that I found some traces of it there, but not only there, in Catholic ideology, and my analysis here is very abstract. Sorry if it appears that I want to focus on Catholicism. I can tell you that when communists were in power in my country, they were much worse in opening this hypocrisy. For example, the official ideology of ex-Yugoslavia was some kind of self-management, anti-Stalinist communism. But the point was that if you took the ruling ideology too seriously, if someone suspects you that you truly believed in it, well, you usually lost your job. It was a very nice paradox, you know, of course. And this is why, if I may make another detour, this is why I like Ayn Rand. When people ask me, like, are you crazy or what? I like ideologists who undermine the ruling ideology, not by subverting it from the outside, but through what I call over-identification, as it were, showing the cards too directly, too openly. That's why her status is very ambiguous, Ayn Rand, you know. She is liberal capitalist individualism at its purest, but she puts it so openly that she cannot become really the official ideology. She's an embarrassment. And guys like this are always the most interesting ones. Like in early modern Catholicism, it's the Jansenists in France, especially Blaise Pascal. This is why he was later in big trouble, excommunicated and so on. He, as it were, showed the cards in a too open way. So this is one strategy. That is to say, the explicit rule of law, regulation prohibits it, the message between the lines, do it discreetly, and so on. But we have also the opposite operation more and more today, where the explicit message is enjoy, have a nice life, and so on, and prohibitions are implicit. But that's another story, I don't have time to develop it, but I think it's crucial for understanding where we are today. I think the diagnosis of some conservative religious people that we don't believe and so on, I totally don't agree with it. I think we believe more than ever today. But what I want to say is that, so that you will see how this multitude of levels function. To analyze the ideological investments of a statement, you must precisely look at these obscene implicit presuppositions. Let me give you a very pathetic example. Let's suppose you read one of these famous ads. I think it was even in today's US Today, which I read in my hotel. You know, the photo of three disfigured lips, black children, and then, you know, contribute some money, you can make a difference, you can save this child's life, and so on and so on. What happens if you, how should I put it, if you ask yourself, but what is the true message of this message beneath the call for charity? I think in majority of cases, and for the majority of us, something pretty cynical, something along the lines of, I know that people are starving, living in horrible conditions around, but I don't care. And this ad is offering me a nice way out. I give the price of a couple of cappuccinos, and not only I get rid of the problem, but I can also claim receive. I try to do something, and so on and so on. The message is, for cheap money, we can, as it were, get rid, make you feel well, and so on and so on. Okay, where are we today with regard to all these tensions? I claim that more and more, the way ideology functions today is directly as anti-ideology. By this I mean as a reference to, how should I call it? If there is an ideological statement today, it's something like, you know, none of us can be reduced just to some ideological category. None of us is simply a capitalist, a liberal, a Christian, an American. Beneath this, each of us is a warm, rich human being with a whole wealth of traumas, dreams, fears, and so on. That's what makes us real human beings. This idea that beneath public identity, we are concrete, rich individuals which cannot be reduced to abstract categories. Why is this ideology? Because the way this functions today, I claim, is to precisely obfuscate the ideological political consequences of what you are doing. Let me take an example maybe known to some of you. The two recent Israeli films, and incidentally I'm not engaged here in Israel bashing and so on. It's a much more complex situation in the Middle East. But two films about Lebanon war. Ari Folman's animated documentary Waltz with Bashir and the more recent Samuel Maoz's Lebanon. As you maybe know, Lebanon draws on the director's own memoirs as young soldier, and the movie renders the war's fear and claustrophobia. How? Most of the action is shot from within a tank. So the movie, as it were, abstracts from the enemies, what they are doing, and withdraw focus to the intimacy of war experience. I claim this is the ultimate, again, ideological gesture. All of a sudden, the political stakes of what goes on, why are we here? Are we killing Palestinians? Do we have the right to be here? And I'm not saying that the answer is necessarily no. I'm just saying that in this way, which appears to be the ultimate way, like forget ideologies, are you aware what horror war is? It's a wonderful way to precisely change something which is a large collective act with consequences, killing, political implications. All that matters suddenly become an intimate experience of fear and so on and so on. That's ideology at its purest. No wonder that in Israel, when I visited, and I often visit the country, I love it, but I encountered again and again this same strategy as part of how IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, legitimize their role. It's very interesting and it's very intelligent, I think, we are doing. They're not saying Arabs are cowards, we are super soldiers, one battalion of us can take over Cairo, whatever. No, they all the time claim, as they put it, military is not in our genes. That is to say that we are people like others. We are also cowards, we can fall into a panic, we cry when there is shooting around us, and so on and so on. I was witness, not literal witness, but saw it on TV there, a supreme example of this ideological manipulation, where an Israeli special unit entered the apartment where an alleged terrorist's family lived, hoping to find the father. He was not there, but mother and children were there. So what happened is that, of course, the children awakened when brutally soldiers entered and started to cry, and mother called her daughter by a name like, come here, then the name, so that I will console you. And then one of the soldiers, Israeli soldiers, realized that his daughter's name is the same as that Palestinian girl's name. And you know what he did? He opened his wallet and, you see, I have also a daughter, the same name, we are all humans, and so on and so on. That's the lie embodied, I claim. Precisely this idea, beneath differences, we are really all the same. If you want to see this ideology at its purest, I advise you to look at a film by Claude Lanzmann, you know, the famous French documentary author, not the one we all know, Shoah, but another one, Tzahal, about Israeli defense forces. But again, it all focuses, the entire movie is about this psychological dimension. No questioning of political consequences, just how did you feel in the Yom Kippur War when Egyptians crossed the Suez Canal, and then you have all this description, I was crying, I was in a total panic. It's all one big psychology. And so that, where does here enter ideology? I cannot but respect, and I mean this without irony, the brutal honesty of the first generation founders of the State of Israel. How differently they were talking, all of them, that is to say, the early Moshe Dayan, and so on, from today's Israeli establishment. I mean, the way to to point out to today's Israel the weak points of their politics is not to criticize them from some abstract position, but simply to remind them what their ancestors were. And not by ancestor, I don't mean the Bible, I mean simply 2 generations earlier, first generation Israeli politicians, they were aware of it. I mean, it's interestingly to read their statements where they clearly say, it's not a question of justice. We are here, we took somebody else's land, maybe we have some right, they also have the right, and it's simply a matter of war, who will take it. I like this attitude, it's at least honest, it openly says with none of this bullshit, and I noticed this bullshit. The nicest example of je sais bien, mais quand même, and among atheist Israelis, this is a standard joke, is how, because do you know that Israel, this renders the country rather sympathetic to me, you know that Israel is the most atheist country in the world. It's about 60%, they are atheists. But there, je sais bien, mais quand même is, there is no God, but nonetheless God gave us the land of Israel. That's basically okay, so look, a wonderful model of how honestly they put it. On 29th of April 1956, a group of Palestinians from Gaza crossed the border to plunder the harvest in the Nahal Oz kibbutz fields, just across. Then there was Roy, a young Jewish member of the kibbutz who patrolled the fields. He tried to chase them away with a stick. He was seized by the Palestinians, carried back to the Gaza Strip, and when the next day the Palestinians gave the body to United Nations forces to return it to the Israel, his eyes had been plucked out. Moshe Dayan, then the chief of staff, delivered the eulogy at his funeral the following day. Listen to this carefully. Let us not cast blame on the murderers today. What claim do we have against their mortal hatred of us? They have lived in the refugee camps of Gaza for the past 8 years, while right before their eyes we have transformed the land and villages where they and their ancestors once lived into our own inheritance. We have transformed. So you see the honesty. It's no bullshitting. It's, we took the land from there, of course they hate us. Moshe Dayan says this. But now comes the mystery, the second paragraph. It is not among the Arabs of Gaza, but in our own midst that we must seek Roy's blood. How have we shut our eyes and refused to look squarely at our fate and see the destiny of our generation in all its brutality? Have we forgotten that this group of young people living in Nahal Oz bears the burden of Gaza's gates on its shoulders? Obvious reference to Samson, the gates of Gaza, and so on. But what's so interesting here is that you see how Dayan is reasoning. In the first paragraph, he openly admits that the Palestinians have at least some kind of right to hate the Israeli Jews since the Jews took their land. His conclusion, however, is not the obvious admission of one's own guilt, but to fully accept what he calls the destiny of our generation in all its brutality. That is to say, to assume the burden, not guilt, but burden of the war where might will be right, where the stronger will win. The war was not about principles of justice, it was precisely an exercise in what Walter Benjamin called the mythic violence. I think if Israel were to return a little bit to this, I'm not saying Israel should say in some stupid, politically correct pro-Palestinian way, sorry that we exist, we move to Europe and so on, but fundamentally, how to put it, fully admit the deadlock. That they don't have the right to simply play in the eyes of Palestinians the good guy. Things would have maybe changed. Okay, many things also have to change among the Palestinians. I totally agree. Consequently, I claim, I will make now a crazy proposal. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict also, this old motto from the 1968, the walls of Paris, soyons réalistes, demandons l'impossible. Let's be realists, let's demand the impossible holds. If there is a lesson to be learned from the endlessly protracted Middle East negotiations, it is that I claim the main obstacle to peace is precisely what is offered as a realistic solution. the two separate states. Although none of the two sides really want this solution. Israel would probably prefer a little bit of West Bank, that it is ready to become a part of Jordan. And the Palestinians also consider the pre-67 Israel part of their land. So first, let's be clear, nobody really wants the two states. But nonetheless, it is somehow accepted by all of us as the only feasible solution. What both sides exclude as an impossible dream is the simplest and most obvious solution. A binational secular state comprising all of Israel plus the occupied territories and Gaza. Now you will say, I know what you will say, I'm crazy utopian. It's a utopian dream disqualified by the long history of hatred and violence. Here I think I have a perfect answer. It's not utopia, it's a reality. Isn't de facto the reality of today's Israel and occupied territories that it de facto is a binational state? It is one state. Israel is de facto in control of it. It's controlled by one sovereign power, the state of Israel, which is then divided by internal borders. So that I claim the task should rather be to abolish the apartheid and transform all of it simply to accept it. It is one state. And I'm seriously advocating it. It may surprise you, but what was for a long time a shocking idea is even accepted more and more by some still marginal parts there. You know why? Because this is the easiest solution even for the West Bank settlers. Nobody has to leave West Bank. It's just that you accept what is de facto one big Israel as a reality, of course, with the proviso of making it de facto secular and so on and so on. Now we'll say it's still madness. Maybe it's it, but then I claim we will not have a solution. It's as simple as that. Okay, let me go on with this idea of humanist, no humanist, just this reduction to, but we are human as the form of ideology. Now I may disappoint some of you, but I would like to begin with, to conclude with the opposite example from today's Cuba. If you want to read one of the most interesting detective writers today, it's Leonardo Padura Fuentes, a Cuban writer who does police procedurals set in today's Havana. His detective hero is an Inspector Mario Conde. And you know, the portrait of Cuba that you get is very realistic. I mean, it's not some idealized socialist Cuba. It's prostitution, poverty, the arrogance of ruling nomenclatura, and so on, even hunger, crime, prostitution. Again, so first I thought, oh my God, this guy must have a nice villa in the suburbs of Miami or whatever. Then I was surprised to learn that not only he lives in Havana, but he is no dissident there. He is their big star, recognized and so on. And then I got it. This is it's a kind of a zero-level defense of today's Cuba. The message is, of course, revolution is screwed up. Of course, it's a misery. We are a lost generation. But nonetheless, and this has nothing to do with politics, it's simple ethical consistency. We must heroically accept what we are, not to escape into the dreams of Miami or whatever, but just with dignity to accept our reality, our love for this country, and to go on living here. I think it's a very desperate strategy, but much more effective than official propaganda. You see, this also is, for me, ideology. Now, a next, more complex step. What we get in this reduction of humans, not to ideological categories, but to concrete human beings, is this what Christians call the love of a neighbor? Does this mean, no, don't treat the other as some abstract category, communist, socialist, capitalist, imperialist enemy, see in him or her the neighbor, a concrete human being? No, it's much more complex here. You know, if you know truly the Judeo-Christian tradition, you must know that neighbor is not a nice guy with whom we sympathize. Neighbor is rather like, did you see there is a movie and a novel which effectively can be called, subtitled into The Becoming of a Neighbor. It's, I think, Stephen King's Shining. Where a normal father becomes a neighbor by becoming this unfathomable monstrosity, and so on and so on. So, my point is that precisely because ideology is explicit ideology, is breaking down. We claim we live in post-ideological time, the only thing that matters is your be what you truly are, and so on, authentic life that you should live, that the fear of the neighbor is explosively growing. How does this function? Let me give you an example which, if some of you were at yesterday's debate, I already mentioned it, but I think I should repeat it because it's crucial. A little bit more than 1 year ago, I was at Harvard with a friend of mine from Slovenia, Mladen Dolar, and at the dinner after our presentations, we had some 8, 9 people. We didn't know each other, so an old professor who invited us said, okay, each of you should present yourself. Please state your name, affiliation, field of work, and your sexual orientation. Okay, for my European sensibility, this was a little bit stupid. No, like, it's none of your business. But what I'm saying here, now comes the point, is that I'm far from engaged here in the usual America bashing. No. You have your levels where you are more coming out open than us. We have our own. My first association was, but wait a minute, what happened when, half a year ago, a friend of mine from United States visited me and other Slovene friends in Slovenia. We went to the Adriatic coast on a beach, and in Slovenia, as it's in most of the Mediterranean countries now, already for 30 years, topless is the standard. Nobody even notices it if you see women's breasts all around. But this was extremely offensive for the American friend. We all saw, he saw, oh my God, another breast, another breast. So you see, the point is that it's not that we are more civilized or whatever. The point is that each culture, and it's a complex reason for why, how does it function, why. For you, it's not a problem to publicly admit up to a point, I know. Your sex orientation, but much more difficult for women to walk topless with us. Nobody even notices it, but, and so on and so on. But what I claim is that precisely what my American friend feared is precisely this is the fear of the neighbor. This desiring other of jouissance, which in a way invades your embarrassingly stupid that narrative usually is. For example, I'm still now traumatized, even thinking about when I was young. One of the standard formulas was, you know, the housewife is alone at home, a plumber comes and says, lady, I fixed the hole in the kitchen, and then lady says, but I have another hole, can you also fix it? Embarrassed. What's the lesson here? I think it's censorship. What is prohibited, to put it very simply, is to have explicit hardcore, see it all, and at the same time, let's call it naively, emotionally engaging, serious story. It's as if it would have been too much. You either have a serious story, but then you don't see it all, or you see it all, but then the story must be ridiculous. It's precisely, you know, if you see it all, this subjective engagement must be censored, which is why, incidentally, I know that in France, for example, Catherine Breillat and some others try to do, let's call them seriously artistic hardcore. Like if you saw maybe her movie Romance. You see everything in sex, but at the same time engaging story. But that's why she cannot make a real breakthrough. That's why she remains marginal. Now, of course, I know this is no longer the case today. But my thesis is that today it's even worse. Today, the predominant, so I was informed, not that I hate hardcore, but it's simply too depressive to watch it. It's like a shortcut to impotence, I claim. Today, when you notice it, if you watch it, it's so-called gonzo, which is a form of pornography where they no longer even pretend that it's a story. A couple does it, or 3, 4, whatever. I don't want to limit myself to a couple because then I will be accused of binary logic. 3, 4 of them, whatever. And then, you know, they engage in a debate with the director, with the cameraman. Am I good? You know, like to make it fun. I claim that censorship is here even more radical. It's as if they are in such a panic that even this minimal of narrative is felt as if it's too much. You had to be reminded can you imagine what terrible censorship this is? You had to be reminded all the time, no, it's just a joke, we are just filming, and so on, and so on, and so on. It's very interesting, this phenomenon. The fear is precisely the fear of the neighbor, I claim. Because if in this stupid copulation that you see there, if you were to fear that there is real desire, passion, emotion there, that would have been the neighbor. That dimension has to be suppressed. So again, the problem is how to maintain a distance towards a neighbor. Here, I claim we are approaching a dangerous state, because in the sense that one of the ways to keep the neighbor as a distance, the neighbor in her intruding proximity, are customs, habits, or rules of civility, and so on and so on. But in our culture of self-exposure and so-called sincerity, authenticity, they function less and less. And incidentally, one of the signs of this failure is, for me, politically correct attempt to directly regulate things. You know what's my problem with political correctness? Let's say how you treat the other in this sexual interaction, if we are talking about politically correct view on sexuality. Of course, I agree with all they say. But what I'm saying is that, how should I put it, it works only if it's part of our, how should I put it, spontaneous customs. The moment you explicitly regulate it, you undermine it in a way you even, in an immediate way, support, sustain aggressivity. Something is missing in this politically correct universe where you try to regulate, to explicitly posit norms, regulate it, and so on and so on. So the result is now, unfortunately, this is no longer a joke, the result is clear in one of the most depressive movies that I've seen. It isn't yet released. A friend of mine from Denmark gave me a copy. You should see when it will come out. It's a documentary called Free Men, When Killers Make Movies, produced by Final Cut Film Production from Denmark, Copenhagen. This documentary is shot in Medan, Indonesia in 2007. It reports on a case of obscenity which reaches the extreme. You know, if you know history, that in 1966, there was a very tense situation in Indonesia. President Sukarno oscillating between communists and right-wingers. The communists tried coup d'etat, the right immediately strike back, and then there was one of the most terrible ethnic political cleansings. Around 2.5 million Chinese were slaughtered, mostly under the pretext that they were suspected communists and so on and so on. So this documentary portrays today's careers of some of the key organizers of that ethnic slaughter, who are nightmarish, brutal people. Now, today they are, of course, senators, businessmen, whatever you want. Now comes the really depressing, terrible thing. They don't hide anything. They publicly boast about it and with pleasure, obvious pleasure, reenact. That's so depressive about this movie. For example, one of their main guys explains to the journalist who interviews him that it took them a couple of weeks to discover which is the most efficient and pleasurable way to rape a woman and at the same time kill her. Now that you need somebody to help you, who puts a wire around her head. I'm not going into details. But now comes the horror. Not only is there no shame, but they do this in front of TV. In front of TV, namely, after a documentary about their life was done, they appeared on a talk show in one of the big state TV channels in Indonesia. And I couldn't believe that conversation. Like, the guy explains how to rape a woman, blah, blah, and then the moderator says, what a wonderful insight, a big round of applause for this gentleman, and so on. It's totally nightmarish. What makes it even more nightmarish but interesting is that they also report to the answer to the crucial question, how were they able to do this? Their answer is, but I'm not blaming Hollywood, don't be afraid, American movies. While they were torturing, killing, and so on, they even dressed as and copied their idea, because they were all movie fans. They liked James Cagney, Humphrey Bogart, those gangster and film noir movies from late 30s, 40s, early 50s. And they acted, even dressed as those heroes. And they imagined themselves as those heroes in action. That's always, I claim, the crucial point. To see, how to put it, to look at the, to analyze which fantasy, which phantasmatic screen made it possible for guys like this to do what they were doing. So, of course, the question to ask here is, what kind of society are we living in where even the minimal public shame is suspended? You know, the Nazis at least claimed, no, we didn't do it, denied it, and you have that famous statement by Heinrich Himmler that Holocaust, killing the Jews, will be the most glorious chapter of German history, but a chapter which unfortunately will never be written. Like, we have to keep it secret. Here it's not even that. They publicly boast about it. The crucial thing here, I claim, is that we should avoid two traps. First, the cheap America bashing, yeah, we see Hollywood, it was the influence, absolutely no, but also not the opposite mistake, which would be a more even racist one, yes, those primitive Indonesians and so on and so on. I think we approach here a much more difficult question of, first, the, let's call them in this learned term, dislocating effects of capitalist globalization. What kind of moral vacuum is created by today's global trends? Because things like this are not happening only in Indonesia. They're happening all around. This gradual, how should I put it, growing obscenity, shamelessness of power, and so on and so on. So, if you allow me to go on with another point, this is why, faced with this, let's call it shamelessness of power, maybe we who want to be the left today, I have here a very obscene proposition, but I mean it very seriously. Maybe the time has come when we, if we want to be still, I want to be a radical left, we should no longer play that role from the 68, you know, imagine the enemy as somebody uptight, conservative, with dignity, and we think we do something liberating if we, I don't know, talk dirty, provocations, and so on. Unfortunately, the power is turning more and more obscene, so maybe things like civility, decency, so maybe we should take it over. Yeah. I will give you an example which maybe will hurt some of you, but the only guy who will appear an idiot is as usual me. I'm at least honest here. Do you remember, maybe some of you do, do you remember a couple of years ago, I think even 93, there was at New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York City, there was the retrospective and Andres Serrano, works 1983-93. There, a photograph, Peace Christ, caused a scandal. It depicts a crucifix immersed in urine, and then there was even a congressional debate, and so on and so on. Predictably, some left liberals defended this painting. Here is how they did it in New York Times. I quote it literally. Like Robert Mapplethorpe, Mr. Serrano struggles against inhibitions about the human body. His use of bodily fluids is not intended to arouse disgust, but to challenge the notion of disgust where the human body is concerned. It is possible to see Mr. Serrano's use of bodily fluids as pure provocation. But you can also believe that Mr. Serrano views them as a form of purification. The fluids make us look at the images harder and consider basic religious doctrine about matter and spirit. End of quote. The problem for me with this defense is that it works all too well. Its logic covers almost everything. Here comes, I warn you, this is obscene. Here comes my provocation. Let us say I were to publish a video clip depicting in detail how I shit, how the anal hole gradually gets wider, then the sausage falls out, while also showing the stupidly satisfied, relaxed expression of my face when the shit falls down. Then you told me, how can you do this vulgarity? Then here is what I will say. Quote, Mr. Zizek struggles against the inhibitions about the His use of bodily excrements is not intended to arouse disgust, but to challenge the notion of disgust where the human body is concerned. It is possible to see Mr. Zizek's use of bodily excrements as pure provocation. But you can also believe that Mr. Zizek views them as a form of purification. The body gets purified by ejecting excrements. The excrements make us look at the images harder and consider basic religious doctrine about matter and spirit and so on. You see my point? It works. So I'm not against very radical artistic provocations. I'm just saying they must really work. You know, like, it doesn't just work if you say, oh, let's provoke and so on. Those in power are provoking us enough. We get enough provocations from them. Now, this finally brings us to the big question you are probably waiting me to address, the question of violence. The great ideological divide between liberal and radical left concerns the use of so-called illegitimate violence. The radical leftist answer was developed, among others, by Bertolt Brecht, who, in his short text, The Intellectual Beast is Dangerous, writes, a quote from Brecht, "A beast is something strong, terrible, devastating. The word emits a barbarous sound." But wait a minute. Does he mean this critically? No, because then the text goes on. The key question, in fact, is this. How can we become beasts? Beasts in such a sense that the fascists will fear for their domination. We have to understand that goodness must also be able to injure savagely. And I think that Brecht, far from being a kind of a proto-totalitarian, is here at his most Christian. He is basically taking over those lines from the Bible, which I, of course, appreciate more. You know, all those theories of Jesus saying, I don't bring love, I bring sword, I bring devastation. If you don't hate your mother and father, you cannot be my follower. If you don't have a sword, buy everything you have, sell everything you have, buy a sword, and so on and so on. How to read this in conjunction with his love your neighbor, and so on and so on. I claim that we need, this is what in Christianity we call work of love. Work of love has to include some kind of violence. The whole point is what kind of violence. I would like to begin by the most elementary levels of insults. My good friend Alain Badiou, recently being accused of using insults, wrote something wonderful in a letter to Le Monde, I think. Here is the quote from Alain Badiou. What characterizes politics, even if capitalo-parliamentarism enforces its domination up to making us forget it, is that in politics there are enemies. And why, for devil's sake, if they are true enemies, should it be prohibited for me to insult them, to compare them to vultures, jackals, bulls, headless linnets, and even to rats, to vipers, fat or not, up to hyenas, literate or not. End of quote. Why do I agree with him? Because I think that the liberal prohibition of enemies, you know, there are no enemies, there are just competitors, and so on, has a very precise implication. If there are no true enemies, if there is no true struggle in politics, this means that those who really disagree with us are not simply our enemies, but are excluded from the very scope of humanity, so anything goes against them. Paradoxically, the first step in recognizing the very humanity of the enemy should be to fully accept the unavoidability of taking sides in politics. It is them or us. There is no third place above the struggle. For example, in 2008, Hugo Chavez, and I'm deeply critical of him, I think he's a failure already. Not external failure, but in itself, in his project, a failure. But nonetheless, I remember how in 2008, Chavez in Venezuela was accused of subordinating the judicial sphere to his executive power, of depriving courts of their independence. But the first thing one should ask upon hearing this accusation is, but which was the state of the judicial system Chavez was intervening into? Who dominated it politically? Was this system really a model of democratic neutrality? That is to say, I had some Lacanian psychoanalytic friends in Venezuela who told me, Chavez is horrible, he changed his constitutional court. I asked them, okay, what was the structure before? They admitted it was just another group, extremely partial, even worse than what Chavez is doing today. Then they added, but it should have been done in a democratic way. Well, why didn't they do it? I think, you know, sometimes here you have to make hard choices. And effectively, that's the brutal logic of politics. Sometimes, how to put it, evoking democracy in such moments effectively means condoning the previous, much worse injustice. This is what I'm tempted to call the parallax lesson of terror. This parallax was rendered perfectly. Now you will say, but this is my European Jacobin perversity. No, it's one of you, of your authors, who put it in wonderful terms. None other than Mark Twain. Listen to these wonderful lines from Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. He's, of course, told, answering to the criticism of those who rejected the Jacobin terror as horror and so on. Quote, it's one of yours, not European decadence. There were two reigns of terror, if we would remember it and consider it. The one wrought in hot passion, the other in heartless cold blood. One shudders, our shudders are all for the horrors of the minor terror, the momentary terror, so to speak. Whereas, what is the horror of swift death by the axe compared with lifelong death from hunger, cold, insult, cruelty and heartbreak? A city cemetery could contain the coffins filled by the brief terror, which we have all been so diligently taught to shiver at and mourn over. But all France could hardly contain the coffins filled by that older and real terror, that unspeakably bitter and awful terror which none of us have been taught to see in its vastness or pity as it deserves. End of quote. So, if one deplores the Jacobin terror, if one does only that, one thereby says yes to that older and real terror. So that's the first thing I'm tempted to emphasize here. It's not a question, I hope you got it, it's not the question that I am advocating Jacobin terror, although de facto I am. But that's another story. No, if you know, let me give you my main reason, which may be weird to you, artistic. You know which is the painting of French Revolution. I hope you, most of us, know it. The famous Jean-Louis David painting, The Death of Marat. Did you notice the strange nature of that painting? It's, let's say this is the painting. The lower third, you have the bathtub, the dead Marat, and then the upper 2/3, you remember what they are? Nothing, just darkness. It's as if he precisely avoided that easy justification. How would this same painting be done, let's say, in a really totalitarian regime? We would have the dead Marat, but instead of seeing this darkness, it would have been filled probably, let's say, by a dream of the dying Marat. Happy French people dancing when the revolution will win. You don't find that there. It's a wonderful painting. Marat is almost squeezed into the frame. And I claim, and I agree here with Clark, the first one, art historian, who emphasized this, it's as if this is the first step towards later Malevich, or Black Square stuff, and so on and so on. I mean, it's a tremendous painting. So, okay, I'm trying to take, not to mention more obvious things like that. You know, stop with terror of the French Revolution. Look at the statistics. In those couple of months of terror, less people were killed than just in a couple of weeks after the Terminor took over. The problem is just that the Jacobins chopped off a couple of high heads, king and so on, while hundreds were instantly killed afterwards. Who cares? Nobody noticed it. Now I will make a step further, maybe even more problematic for you. What we should question here is a certain way of so-called anti-totalitarianism, which I find problematic, and I will try to explain why. I would like to take as the starting point the liberal enthusiasm for the so-called third wave phenomenon. Maybe you remember it. I am here referring to an event. I think it was in some California high school in the 60s, where, you know, it's the old story. A professor wanted to teach his students how was Nazism possible. So he told them, let's organize a society. Let's organize a movement called the Third Wave. The professor told his students that the motto of this movement will be strength through discipline, strength through community, strength through action, strength through pride. He disciplined them and so on and so on. And then he himself was shocked at how students, pupils, this was high school, started to collaborate. They, even without him asking his pupils, they even started to denounce to him some of others, you know, they don't really follow the rules and so on and so on. So he was so shocked that after 4 days, he convoked a meeting and told them, listen, this was all an experiment, it's a fake. I hope you now understand how easily it was to seduce people to become totalitarian. And then, of course, with liberals, you get a multiple orgasm. You see how the beast is lurking at that moment we can become. I totally reject this reading. I think that this experiment was deeply mystifying. And okay, I will not go into the detail. If you want the detailed analysis, read my next book. But my answer is simply this one. What is false in this experiment is that it opposes directly the so-called liberal, peaceful, tolerant openness and the universe of discipline, strength, action, and so on and so on. All that differs from liberalism into that group. Sorry, what I'm tempted to say is that I can well imagine a movement which requires discipline, pride, strength through community, action, and so on, and which I would totally support. My God, all radical emancipatory movements also function like that. I can imagine a radical emancipatory movement which says, yes, strength through discipline. Why? My God, because imagine a poor country, because we are poor, we don't have arms, the only thing we have is our discipline, our unity, and so on and so on. The trick of this operation is precisely that it throws all of it together. Emancipatory discipline is ultimately the same as the right-wing fascism, they are all the same, and so on and so on. What I claim is that the crucial distinction is blurred here. Sometimes we need discipline, we need sacrifice, and so on. We shouldn't leave all these categories to the enemy. My God, if you listen to some of the radical, even left liberals, it is as if you say, my God, comrades, discipline, we need order, proto-fascist, proto-totalitarian, and so on. No, I don't buy this. But don't misunderstand me here. This doesn't mean I am advocating a new fascism or whatever. What I'm advocating is something much more, and even with violence, I'm very careful. I would say, if you allow me just to conclude very briefly now, I would say one thing here. When I talk about violence, I'm not talking about so much active violence in the sense of killing, whatever. Okay, sometimes that is needed, but I'm the first to concede it should be used purely in, or at least predominantly in defensive terms. I'm saying two much more precise things. First, that violence should be much more, let's call it an interruptive violence. A violence of stopping when the situation is unbearable. A violence of non-participating. In this sense, I answer to that stupid polemics against me in the New Republic, and I will develop in my future book how. Yes, violence, but violence in the sense in which, as I wrote, to provoke my enemies, in which the problem with Hitler was that he was not violent enough. In what sense? Then I go on, in the sense in which Gandhi was more violent than Hitler. In what sense? Hitler's violence was pure violence of impotence. He killed millions because he didn't dare to change a little bit capitalist relations or whatever. It was clearly a violence, how to put it, he was doing all possible things so that nothing would really change. While whatever you think about Gandhi, he really wanted to interrupt, stop the functioning of the British state in India. So this is my first point. My second point, the first violence should be directed against ourselves. By this, no, I don't mean any masochist whipping to render us saints or whatever, but a very painful process of, how should I put it, violently breaking with or getting rid, liberating ourselves from the dreams which are not our dreams, how should I put it. You know, the problem, the true problem, as if there is a lesson to be learned from 20th century revolutions, which is why I'm the first to admit they were a total catastrophe, maybe the greatest tragedy in humanity, the total fiasco of the communist left, which ended in Stalinism and then in the later decadence and so on and so on. We should learn from this total ethical, political, economic and so on catastrophe. The first lesson is that, as Hegel knew it, the German idealist, it's not enough to overthrow the enemy. First, you must overthrow the hold the enemy has over your dreams, as it were. You must not, to put it pathetically, dream dreams which are not really yours. Just one example here, a wonderful novel from a writer from the ex-communist country, the Albanian writer Ismail Kadaver. I advise you to read it. It's available in translation. A wonderful short novel called The Palace of Dreams. It's a story of Tabir Sarai, a palace of dreams in the capital of an unnamed vast 19th century Balkan empire, basically Turkey, modeled on Turkey. It's a crazy story. The idea is this one. In this great society, in this great palace, thousands of bureaucrats collect dreams from the entire population and interpret them, and then try to isolate the central dream to give it to the Sultan as providing the key to the future of the country. The reason for this palace and for all the struggles among different factions about which dream will be privileged as the master dream is nicely spelled out in the novel. Now I quote a short passage from the novel. In my opinion, Kurt went on, Kurt is one of the heroes of the novel, it is the only organization in the state, this Palace of Dreams, where the darker side of its subject's consciousness enters into direct contact with the state itself. The masses don't rule, of course, but they do possess mechanism through which they influence all the state's affairs, including its crimes. And that mechanism is the Palace of Dreams. Do you mean to say, asks the cousin, that the masses are to a certain extent responsible for everything that happens, and so should to a certain extent feel guilty about it? Yes, said Kurt, and so on and so on. That's crucial. How every power always reproduces itself through, let's call it, ideological dreams, fantasies, which, by means of which subjects themselves are, in a way, invested into the structure of power. And the first step of liberation is to get rid of this hope. Let me take the extreme example. If some of you know Russian literature, you will know what I'm talking about. It even shocked me. Stalinism at its worst. But it's shocking if you read the biographies even of great dissidents, Mandelstam, Shostakovich, dissident, okay, Pasternak, and so on. How they were all incredibly fascinated by Stalin, as if with all their terrible experiences, they incredibly wanted to meet. You know the tragic story when Stalin called Pasternak, asking him after Mandelstam was arrested, "Are you a friend of Mandelstam? Mandelstam, what should we do with him?" And Pasternak tried to squeeze out, "I don't know." Then Stalin said, "Tell me, we should talk." Then Pasternak says, "Yes, I would like to talk about you, about death and life, the meaning of life." And Stalin cut it, and so on. The same with Mandelstam, the same with Bulgakov, and so on. They all, at the level of dreams, were invested in. And again, the first step of liberation, which of course is not physically violent, but it is to do this, to, how should I put it, to change your dreams, as it were. Which is why, incidentally, I like the movie, which some people think it's proto-fascist. I think it's not. It's one of the greatest Hollywood movies, Fight Club. I don't think it's a proto-fascist film. I think the lesson is precisely this. Before you beat others, you must beat yourself. In the sense of beating out of you all that phantasmatic content by means of which you are invested libidinally into power, which is why one of the ultimate shots from Hollywood is, for me, you remember that scene when Ed Norton, confronting his boss, starts to beat himself. This is the first step of liberation. It's much more horrible than, because you get my point. If he were to attack the boss directly, it would have meant, screw you, I want to be boss. By beating himself, he ruins the entire field. My last point, really the last. Here, maybe just to conclude, I would like to make one point clear so that you will not accuse me of being confused. I'm well aware that I used the term violence in an indistinct way. I did my homework. I'm well aware of these nice distinctions drawn among others by Hannah Arendt between power, authority, and violence. Power being, let's call it the natural authority, the charisma that some people have. Authority is always a social relation. Often you don't have to have a personal charisma to have authority. You know all these stories of somebody is a jerk, an idiot. Once you see he has a crown, oh, it's authority. And violence, here Hannah Arendt does something intelligent. He opposes violence and power. For them, as he puts it, for her, as he puts it in wonderfully precise terms, violence is ineffective in the sense that it's always a sign of impotence. violence is the resort of those who precisely don't have power. Which is why a power which has to resort to direct violence is a power which is already in hand. This may sound strange to you, but if you read memoirs of how they perceived its rule, Hitler, Stalin, and so on, they were all the time in total panic. That's why, again, they had to be continuously violent. But at some, so this is incidentally true even at the level of personal authority. Let's take the traditional figure of the father. I hope you get it, or I hope this is also your experience, at least it's mine, that a father who actually beats you, it may hurt, but it's a ridiculous, ultimately impotent figure. With a true father, with authority, violence is purely virtual. You know, just looks at you, no? The moment he has to act out, take recourse to real violence, it's an admission of defeat, basically. Okay, but where I would nonetheless disagree with Arendt is that the whole point is precisely that there is always a level of, how should I put it, indistinction between violence and power, a structurally necessary breakdown of their distinction. There has to be a threat of violence behind power, and the way every power retains its authority is precisely through obfuscating the violence on which it is based. And with this, I conclude. I claim that the first step, and this is my point of violence, I'm not advocating violence. I'm just saying that the first step of politicization is to see violence there where we do not even perceive it. So when we have today terrorist violence, I'm not telling you, no, this is nothing. I'm not telling you, oh, they had the right to strike back, we exploited them. But I am telling you, don't focus yourself only on visible violence. See the economic violence, all other forms of traumatic experiences and so on, which are, how should I put it, part of the system, which are needed so that precisely things remain the way they are. And the first gesture of a critical analysis is precisely to see violence there where violence is not even perceived as such. To give you an example, which I hope you will immediately get it and agree with it, wasn't this the first great gesture of feminism way back in the 60s? What appeared before as just kind of a natural division or authority, you know, a man has authority and so on, it was reinterpreted not as a charisma authority, but precisely as false authority grounded in violence. To see violence where there is no violence, to unmask dignified authority as grounded on obscene violence, this is the first gesture to do. And so this would be my conclusion. Not, of course not. I mean, I did go through a civil war, modest in my case, but nonetheless, I'm no admirer of violence, you know. In contrast to some of my pseudo-radical leftist friends who say, oh, so wonderful, that open moment when people take over, when state power disintegrates. I tell them, wait a minute, did you ever witness this? I can tell you, when public power disintegrates, no, there is nothing pleasant about it. No, it's all one fear, anxiety. So I'm saying, nonetheless, what we should do, it's the only way to understand what goes on today. It's just to learn to see violence in all its scope. To see violence not only where it's open violence, but violence at all the levels where it is not even visible as such. And next step, to counteract it with, if necessary, violence, but not murderous violence, but what I'm tempted to call interruptive violence, which sometimes even amounts to do nothing. To do nothing when you are expected to do something, when your activity, your participation sustains the system. I effectively think, and that's the entire secret of my advocacy of violence, that Gandhi has to be reinvented today. Gandhi in his so-called non-violence concerning killing and so on, but also Gandhi in his idea of, really interrupting what's going on. Without this kind of structural violence, violence of like interrupting the system, well, we are approaching a society gradually, a new apartheid society of ecological and other catastrophes where, well, it is a world where I effectively wouldn't like to live. Thanks very much for your attention. And applaud. When we hardline communists take it over, you will have to do it. So keep your energy for later. So sorry, I'm grateful, but I hope at least that I clarified some of the misunderstanding when I'm usually accused of some kind of a madman waiting for violence. My God, I mean, listen, I didn't see it, but, like all those debates about violence, my God, did you see? I didn't see what I saw from Yugoslav war, which was extremely brutal. Post-Yugoslav war, Bosnia, and so on. I mean, I spoke with many journalists who told me, Middle East civilization, you cannot compare with post-Yugoslavia. I mean, things happen there which you can't imagine, like the standard procedure when, for example, but there are also examples from others, Serbs took a Bosnian village was what? Something like you isolate young girls, you rape them in front of their fathers, to ruin everything. Then you cut the balls of the father has to eat his own balls, then you blind him, the father has to eat his eyes, blah, blah, blah. Like, all those pure liberating violence, I mean, I would like them to see a little bit of this. But nonetheless, the problem is that my distrust of liberalism is that, nonetheless, this purely procedural democracy, you will just vote and so on, also doesn't work. Some kind of a shock is necessary, which is why I advocate what I would have called a new version of some kind of a, let's call it Gandhian interruptive violence. With, again, the most important element being to see, this is maybe one of the big tasks of intellectuals today, to make us see violence where it's not even seen. And this would be, for example, for me, the way to interact with Arab world. Not liberate them by bombing them, but somehow, I don't know how, but it can be done, in full solidarity with them, for example, for their women, to make them experience their situation as victim of violence, and so on, and so on. There is work, theoretical work to be done. I mean, this may sound idealistic, but I think it's at the same time very political in a concrete sense. You know Freud, this wonderful passage from Virgil, Aeneid, Freud, Acheronta movebo, move the underground. Like if you cannot move things on earth, move the underground, which means revolution starts by moving, by revolutionizing your dreams, what is beneath. Then only in this way you get ready to really change something. Sorry for another preaching. Now we can play as if we are in a democracy. So please, but be aggressive. I am myopic, and then I don't see hands raised, and then I'm a racist, anti-feminist, and so on, which I am, but I am a universal racist, as I emphasize. I hate all nations, all ethnic groups. That's how you can be truly honest today. Please.
Okay,
But just, do you hear her?
I'll talk really loud.
Perfect. Okay, sorry,
So I
please.
have a question for
Yeah.
you. I think I understand your concept of intellectual violence, but when does it stop? And how do we
first, look, it will maybe, probably you will disagree, but I would say that why should it stop? I mean, wait a minute, sometimes violence is needed. You know, it's hard to admit it, but don't you think that sometimes violence is needed? Not only big pathetic examples, like, for example, what would you say in Europe in 1940? No, you cannot beat Hitler with intellectual violence. You should kill. No, one has to say this to make it clear. The task was there to kill Germans, to terrorize them, to throw them into a panic. This doesn't mean that I agree with everything. Scandalous things were going on. For example, recently I visited Hamburg, where they showed me even today there is bitterness, and justified bitterness, by how in Hamburg, you know, the rich Hanseatic cities with many villas, and practically all the bombing we've been seeing today was targeted on the working class suburbs. All the rich, so I'm not justifying everything. The first thing I'm saying is that how should I put it? The limit for me is not where to stop in the sense of certain things are prohibited, we shouldn't do. Okay, let me provoke you, but in a friendly way. Provoke you in the sense of, let me give you an extreme example. Maybe I use it in one of my last books, but I don't even know where I can imagine a situation, you may disagree with me, but I stand by it, where I would kill a person, directly, brutally, hopefully poison him, a person who even didn't do anything really violent against other people. Let me tell you, okay, now, after this bombastic announcement, in Argentina, I learned about a regular figure in these military regimes, which were, as we all know, torturing prisoners, the so-called doctor, medical psychiatric advisor. He didn't do anything dirty, just, let's say, that's friends are for, let's say I have to torture you. Life is life. No, okay. I call a doctor who examines you and said, what do you want? You want this guy to survive, torture him in this way, kick him into the kidneys, so much electricity into his balls, and so on. You can go to the end, then one eye. You know, you just give the advices, and then you go, and then you can say, sorry, I didn't do nothing, and so on. If I were to be, sorry for the ridiculous melodrama, with such a person, and at a table, and if I were to be sure that, A, even if I denounce him to the police, the guy, how can you have good connections, nothing would happen. B, if I were to have an opportunity by chance, although I don't know what ridiculous chance, a little bit of good poison in my pocket, and let's say you go to the toilet, I would without any problem poison. Maybe I wouldn't, but then I would be ashamed of myself for not doing it. I think I would have done it. Without any problem, I would have killed you. So, you know what I mean? I don't think the problem is here. Can we do this? Can we do that? Maybe there are situations where you do many things. The problem is not this. The moment you accept this formulation, you already, I think, play the game of those in power, because they are doing, how should I put it, the problem is not this one of these crazy, irrational exceptions, however we call them. The problem is elsewhere. The problem is, for me, still, how, with regard to the process of liberation, and not liberation in some obscure Stalinist sense, but let's put it naively, authentic liberation, how does violence function? And I'm ready to, how should I put it, it's like the title that I used a long time ago, liberation hurts. I don't believe, unfortunately, in this idea, you know, somehow we will just be nice, politically correct, and things will happen, and so on. No, there are moments when you have to act, and so on, and even more, you know, unfortunately. There are moments where you have to act without being covered by any democratic or whatever procedure, unfortunately. There are moments where it's a question, do I do it or not, fast, and so on. But of course, I see no danger in where some people like to see danger. But how then can we be sure that this will not explode? You know, this wisdom, which has its justification, that yes, many things started like this, and then violence have a tendency of reproducing itself endlessly, turning into a terror, and so on and so on. This is a totally serious problem. I admit it. It was the catastrophe of the 20th century. I'm the first to admit it. I'm the first to admit that even, like, if we can be so vulgar and look at it quantitatively, in a way, there was more suffering, sorry for this obscenity, in Stalinist Russia than in Nazi Germany. Because, you know, in Nazi Germany, terror was nonetheless limited to Jews, communists, and so on. In the high point of terror in Stalinism, it was real madness, like everyone could be a victim. There were no rules. But what I'm saying is that I don't like this logic of, you see, if you start with a revolution, it necessarily ends in death. No, I claim that it ends in terror at a very precise moment, and that moment, I don't think that the logic is that of a direct passage from revolutionary violence to that, how should I put it, to this, how should we call it, post-revolutionary state terror. I think things are more complex here. I know I didn't satisfy you. I cannot in 5 minutes now, but...
No, you didn't, but you're talking about structural violence. And
yeah, but also, unfortunately, I talk also, sometimes, if necessary, about, how should I put it in naive terms, real interpersonal violence. You know, it all depends on, how should I put it, when you are the victim of violence, what are you allowed to do to strike back? I don't accept any a priori limits. And no, not understand it. I'm not, for example, in any way, not even a mediated way, condoning so-called Middle East terror or whatever. I think first there is absolutely no emancipatory potential in it. Look at the ideology. I'm here. You know, you think I was just Israel bashing. No. I do what few people do. When we talk about Hamas, Hezbollah, and so on, I look at their website in English. And then you learn what they are really saying. It's not even the Jews are the enemies. It's that they say it very clearly. The greatest enemy, the point things went wrong in the West is the French Revolution, with all these ideas of feminine equality, blah, 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 and so on, which ruined the organic order, and so on. So I'm not justifying any of this. I'm just saying that maybe we differ here, that I'm not ready to accept any, how should I put it, any a priori limitations, like, but we will never kill. Who knows? There are situations where I claim, crazy as it sounds, you are ethically obliged to kill. I know it sounds crazy, but I honestly tell you what do I mean. You know why? Because I have another bitter experience. The experience of how all those ideologies which proclaimed non-violence ended up, as a rule, justifying even worse violence. Like my royal example, but not the only one, and I respect it, is, for example, Tibetan Buddhism. I mean, I read a couple, no, I will not repeat my old stories about that wonderful book, Brian Victoria, Zen at War, which shows how Zen was militarized. But I read a couple of other historical books which point out very nicely how, like, to put it in very vulgar terms, if you try to measure on average when some regimes in East Asia were at least for some time ruled by Buddhist kings, how did this affect the level of violence, where, if anything, violence went up? And it's a wonderful task to analyze in a close-up, closely, how this, allegedly we love the no holistic, not dominating, pacifistic spiritual attitudes, how they ended up justifying even radical violence. So I just, okay, I will make another, because you terrorize me in a good way. I believe in terror here, like one should be embarrassed by questions. I'm not even saying that I precisely know so that I would be able now to give you a precise answer and so on and so on. It's more that almost instinctually I am afraid of these easy solutions, you know, as if when you say, no, we will resist, but we will never do this, as if you solve the problem in this way. I don't believe that this principled self-limitation changes anything. It's actual.
So let me finish with one last
Yes.
question. How would you teach people to be violent effectively? What would your curriculum for violence?
It's not so much how to teach them, they find the way. It's more just, I will give you an example. What is the limit of my violence? In the sense of a regime, Aristide in Haiti, what he was doing. 1000% I stand behind him. And he did something, he never abolished democracy and so on. There was a certain violence in the sense of self-organizing the people, but it's absolutely clear that this violence was a reaction against the violence financed by not only the United States, all of them and so on. Here you have, it was in a way, a society at war. He did certain things, but although it was, he would have been, to give you a concrete example, he would have been the limit. Another example of violence that I would still support. First, let me put it clearly, none of the, of course, terrorist acts, but it didn't happen here, I remember in Slovenia. No, sorry. Megalomania, crazy. In Greece, maybe you remember it was in your media, these big student demonstrations which exploded and were a little bit violent, like breaking windows in the cities. I support that. Because it's hypocritical to say, no, you should do it in a more peaceful way. Well, now I will talk like an ideologist. Let's cut the bullshit. If they were not to break some windows, nobody would even have noticed them. They did it. It was the right thing to do it. And for example, with you, today in California, the scandal with your education, they're falling apart. A little bit of violence in the sense of blocking traffic, causing chaos, I would support that today in California. No killings, but my God, you know, are people aware what is going on? And I'm not now talking as some kind of a crazy leftist, but even as a, how to put it, honest guy who loves the United States and worries about it. This is catastrophe in the long term for education and so on. It's madness what is going now in California. And people just ignore it. No, somebody has to do something, even if it's, in this sense, violent or interrupting the run of things so that people will notice it. You have to do it. You have to do it. I know, again, that I didn't satisfy when. I am aware of problems here. All I'm saying that this simple liberal strategy, we do this, but never that. I don't buy that.
Slavoj, quick question from an old communist too. Towards the end of the defense of lost causes, when you draw that distinction between the impotent acting out, the passage à l'acte,
Yeah.
that you also referred to today, the example of the father, right?
Yeah.
The violent father who's
Yeah.
the most impotent. And the true revolutionary
Yeah.
event of violence. You talk about the Soviet Union, and you refer to the Moscow trials of the 30s as the impotent acting out,
Yeah.
and the collectivization of the late 20s as still a true revolutionary event.
No, I'm more ambiguous there. Okay, but whatever. Please,
The question is, to go back to that legacy and to rethink it, the question that we always confront is, when did things start going bad, right?
Here,
When
this is a
did
wonderful
that violence
question.
begin to be
I
acting out?
think it's in a way very, something is wrong with this question. You know why? Because if you ask this question seriously, then the only consistent answers are somewhere between Heidegger and Adorno. For Heidegger, it's Plato. For Adorno, it's even worse. It's basically, in the dialectic of enlightenment, it's the first primitive man who tried to manipulate with magic or whatever, no? You know how this goes. You know, I'm well aware that you can always go back. You say Stalin. No. Behind Stalin was Lenin. No. Behind Lenin was Marx. No. Behind Marx was Rousseau. No. Behind Rousseau was Probably Luther, no. And this is now Peter Sloterdijk theory, it's Christianity. For him, Christianity is the culprit behind communism. I agree with it, but positively, no?